Hello and welcome to the Economic and Social History Society's second episode of our podcast. We are so excited to be discussing the impact that deindustrialisation had on the world during the 20th century. Today, we're joined by Zoe.
Abheer, Max.
To those who are not aware of what deindustrialisation is, it's the breaking down of an industry, leading to sometimes catastrophic job loss.
Well, imagine this is the year of 1970. You're looking out for a job, and all you hear in the media is people are losing out their jobs, and inflation is on rapid rise. This is what the decade of 1970 was like. We saw more than 2.5 millions of jobs being vanished in the UK itself. We had four major powers: the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, and the European Union. That wasn't formed until yet. But you can kind of get the idea of the countries that were around there. What we basically saw was this rapid loss of employment. All these countries were powerhouse because of their manufacturing capabilities, their capabilities to manufacture products and sell it to the world, and making sure the balance of payments are being correct. And by the time it came in 1990s, we saw one fifth of the employment basically gone from manufacturing. So what happened? What went wrong? What were the implications? What were the importance? That is what we're going to discuss today.
Yeah.
The first major question is, what are industries and what was their importance, especially in the UK? Max, do you want to say?
Well, one of maybe something we can focus on was the geography, and as I understand, the manufacturing was a major pillar, especially if you're talking about places like Northern England, the Midlands, England, and Scotland in particular. For example, like the city we live in, Glasgow, was thriving in the shipping industry. So industry is very important in the UK, especially for these regions. But obviously, ever since I think at least starting in the 1960s and to 70s, especially to the 80s, a lot of these industries have basically gone away. And with it, a lot of employments, which, for a lot of these families traditionally going to shipping, for example, is just gone. So I think if we're talking about deindustrialization, we very much also seeing sort of this transition from employing manufacturing industries to something much more like services in general. So that's how important it is.
Yeah, so no, I was just saying how Max talked about the importance of Glasgow and all those industries that played a major role in employing families, and now how about they didn't have any job per se to go on with. And I think what's more interesting about the industries was that during the 19th century we saw basically Britain going through a capitalistic revolution. This was the first example of industrial capitalism as opposed to the exchange between individuals. I think that becomes really important because industries became more and more organized during the 19th century. And this was one of the first examples where we saw industries going up, making money, and we're looking at people having their lives being improved, especially during Victorian period. And then also sort of the expansion of British Empire across the Commonwealth. We saw one of the main motives of that was to revolutionize the industries and making sure they have more and more money by going through the ideas of mercantilism and trade. And that's why when you come back again and look at 1970s and 80s, what we see as basically 200 years of industries that basically supported lives and people in the UK were no longer there. We saw them diminishing quite gradually, quite slowly, quite painfully. And then we have people losing our jobs as well. I think that becomes really interesting. And also with Glasgow being the second industrial city, it was probably one of the richest cities across the world because of its shipbuilding capabilities and the amount of money it made. And that went on to also help diminish its poverty that was there and people that would come up Glasgow too as well. We saw making up of new cities as well. Grangemouth comes to mind, and Greenock across the western Scotland as well. But now, if we go out and look at them, we will see them to be one of the most deprived areas in the UK as well. I think that becomes really interesting. That what happened to those industries? Why did they lose out jobs?
As well as that, as Glasgow was really, really, really thriving when it came to like industries and jobs and stuff. And then like obviously building on the economy, employing loads of shipbuilding, engineers, people in heavy industry. So yeah, Glasgow was very much very rich in industry. As well as you were saying Greenock as well. That was very well known for shipbuilding in the 50s and 60s. Obviously, when technology started to take over, that's when people started losing their jobs, and that's when, poverty levels would go up, crime levels would go up, and that's why Scotland's in the mess it is today, basically.
I guess maybe some would push back against the sort of what would the people in economic social history would call the declinist narrative, which basically portrayed that, not just in regards to industrialization, the industrial decline is also just in general natural decline of the UK. I guess another way to look at it is that as you had in deindustrialization, you had this shifting from employment to from the like manufacturing, mining, industrial employment in general to services. You also had rising living standards. You had also, less pollution. You also had better workplace safeties because you're not in, these very dangerous working environment that is associated with industrial employment, such as mining, shipbuilding, and so on. So perhaps maybe it wasn't all just doom and gloom in regards to industrial decline and deindustrialization. Now, having said that, obviously, we definitely seen property level increase. We saw social deprecation, especially in places like Scotland. So the effects of deindustrialization is definitely real. It's all around us. But we live in one of those places, one of those cities that is impacted by it. But I guess maybe, but this is to say that I think this is something that you will read in honors years. You'll be exposed to literature from, for example, somebody like James Thompson. This kind of declinist narrative is like somewhat overblown or at least mischaracterized, which is that for some people in the UK, they have benefited from this sort of shift towards the services, but other people has basically left behind. So is this a case of should we reverse the trend of the industrialization,
Mm.
or is it more of a case of we need better distribution of the gains and the goods that we get from the shift towards service?
So, do you think that deindustrialization was better for Scotland in the long run, or do you think it was worse?
I think it really does depends on, like, for example, what is your position within the economy. And obviously, I think Scotland, not just Scotland, but Northern England, or talk about Midlands, have definitely got the short end of this stick here.
Mhm.
And that would imply that you need more distributed politics from the south.
Yeah.
I think this is why deindustrialization becomes one of the major concerns or the most important topics. This it can explain almost everything that's going wrong or nice with the Scottish economy. At one point, the major question is that even though we did see manufacturing and industrial decline,
Hmm.
but the productivity was still there, the standard of living was still there. So people were still making money. We still saw people going up to the mass consumption as well. We saw the rapid development of mobile phones. We saw internet coming down. We saw laptops coming up. Wouldn't be able to do this podcast if it was not for deindustrialization and people making a lot of money. So that becomes a really, really important point. And this is mostly what American economists say all the time. The major one is Rothen and Coates as well, the IMF economists all the time, because that we wouldn't see the rise of rapid technology. We wouldn't see people making as much money as they did had not gone up to the services. So clearly, point is that productivity was still there. It rose, if you believe in economist Seng's argument, the Cambridge professor, it rose at 3.5%, and that was massive. And in today's age, since 2008, it's not even 1%.
Yeah.
And at that time, we saw it rapidly rising at 3.5% during those transition periods as well. So the manufacturing was still there. I mean, the manufacturing is still there today as well. The only thing is that people are still mass consuming. We still need water bottles. We still need chairs. We still need our glasses.
Yeah.
Right back then, even clothes and shipping and chemicals, they would all come up from Glasgow High Street. It would come. Toblerone chocolate, the very famous Swiss chocolate, used to be manufactured in Dundee. Coca-Cola used to be manufactured in Dundee itself, and all those famous things that we talk about all was one manufactured in the UK because of the high tech capabilities that Britain had. But now it's all gone to either China or it's been outsourced to India. I mean, Germany still makes a lot of electric car components and also the general car components as well. It still makes a lot of money. So see, the manufacturing is still there, but the major question, as Marx put in the end, is that what does it mean for distributive politics? But what it did was that we saw changing geographies, and that becomes really important. You go out town and let's say Greenock and Gora. I was there yesterday. You go out town in Dundee. You still got some parts of Glasgow that are mostly deprived. At one time, if you go and read the history, you realize how rich they were, and then you see them basically being ghost town and people being dependent on social housing, which is a good thing, and I believe in that. But at the same time, most people they wouldn't like it because they would want to go out, have kind of their life. They want to go out and travel and basically not being dependent on other people. And this is what it has done. So how do we distribute economy, and at the same time, how do we also enhance our living standards. I think that becomes a really crucial point in this debate. That what do we do? What is the big economic idea that gives us both productivity, high standard of living, and at the same time not make our towns look like ghosts, not make our town or people believe that there is no future out there.
Well, I think what's a really interesting point, because you were saying that you were at Greenock yesterday. Greenock has declined a lot because of deindustrialisation. But you look at places like, and this might be a bit of an unfair comparison, but you look at places like Glasgow or Dundee who have deindustrialised, and they're still thriving because they've managed to work around this deindustrialisation. But places like Greenock, they haven't managed to thrive. They haven't managed to figure out a different way to help people live and work through this deindustrialisation, because it feels like since in deindustrialisation, people were like, well, Glasgow is moving on from deindustrialisation. Everybody go and work in Glasgow. So that's why the town started to decline so rapidly, because people were just not focusing on, well, this is us taking a hit from deindustrialisation, but how do we repair ourselves? Because it was so difficult. We also had we had the IBM in Greenock, and that was a really, really big employer. And then the IBM pulled out,
Hmm.
but the IBM was really, really big, as well as shipbuilding was really big. But then they pulled the shipyards out, they pulled the IBM out, and there was no jobs, nothing. And that's when people start to say, well, we may as well go to Glasgow, we may as well go to Dundee or Canada or like another country, because they're the ones that's got the jobs. They're the one that's pulled themselves back from this whole deindustrialisation scenario. And they're the ones that are thriving, and we're not. So that's obviously just a very personal account that I've got from obviously where I live, which is frustrating because we still, even today, we still struggle with jobs. Like I'm personally looking, I was looking for a job for like my cousin the other day, could not find any jobs, no jobs at all. And if there are jobs, they're all service jobs. There's no like hands-on, like welding, for example. Maybe there's a few mechanic jobs, but most of the jobs are like either you need to relocate. One was in Australia, one was a roofer in Australia. You don't get a good hands-on job unless you come to Glasgow or unless you go like across the water to like Helensburgh, for example. But here in Greenock, you don't get the same opportunity as other places that have recovered from deindustrialisation.
I think this are the phases throughout what was happening in Glasgow in the last 200 years. Basically, before Victorian period, Glasgow had no money. There were slums. People did not have nice area to live, and they had to go to really harsh shifts and weather being really stormy. And then Victorian age came in. They started manufacturing stuff. They started becoming more rich during the Victorian time. They built architecture. And there were a lot of things that they started building. The major famous one was steam engine. It was built right here in the Clyde River. That was really important. And then if you go and see Empire, there were many Scottish generals coming from Glasgow, basically handing out the manufacturing products from the UK and the Empire. So that was there. And then you see all these people from other cities, like they're not Cork. And then talking about cities coming from Stirling and even from Southside, Dumfries coming to Glasgow and work because it became such a big industrial powerhouse. And that sort of diminished all the poverty that was there, all the unemployment that was there. But what happened in the 70s and 80s was that Glasgow again started begin to decline. And if you believe in American economists and how the Americans think, it was that when it was time for them to transition to the insurance and banking, they didn't do it in a way they should have done it. And it happened pretty late, and it happened probably just recently. We saw JPM, PNB investing and starting opening the offices again, and then you might see some more knowledge jobs or information jobs being created. But again, the situation is still like people still go to Glasgow. The money is still there. The standard of living is still there. But the kind of distribution is not there. There's, as Max talked about before as well. And I think all those things you talk about, people living in hardships and suffering, and all the things that happen. Major point here becomes is that it has led to deeply, deeply problematic and populist politics on rise as well in the UK. If you go around and see all the towns as when Reform UK seats, especially in Clacton, if you see the rise of Reform UK in Scotland as well, you will see them only rising in neglected areas. The areas that were one industrial powerhouse, people had brilliant jobs, good jobs, enough jobs to get a house, get a car for themselves, pay for their sister's wedding, pay for their own wedding, go out and having a nice life, go on abroad, have vacations, and that is almost gone for them, and that has resorted them gone in populist politics, and I think this is where Max also shined. So, Max, do you want to comment on what has it led to the rise in populism and how it has balanced things
I
out?
think before I talk about populism, I think maybe just go back to your point, as always point about these loss of employments and jobs in these local communities. I guess maybe a big context to highlight a little bit was that maybe back in the 70s and 80s, you had to remember we are still talking about a period during the Cold War,
Yeah.
where there is a more of a control over flow of capital, control over where industries move and so
Mhm.
on, right? And one of the things I remember doing the course on British capitalism is that one of the point they make is that even after the falls of the empire in decolonization in 1960 and so on, Britain still maintained quite a sizable military armaments industry because it very much still sees itself as part of the some of the empire in a sense. It need to like basically maintain a large military. So in that sense, maybe that sort of explain why you still have a lot of low industrial capacity even into the 80s
Mm.
and being spread across different local community across the UK. But obviously that's gone because you had the sort of end of the Cold War and the commencement of the globalization. And you sort of see the effects of that kind of specialization and accumulation and the movement of these industry away to somewhere, green pasture elsewhere.
Mhm.
So I guess what that may imply is that maybe we need some of that control back if we
Yeah.
want to, for example, basically keep the employment here. But that will basically go against, the sort of the trend, the marketization, the globalization. Going to the point about populism, yeah, obviously, these towns are gutted.
Yeah.
They're devastated. Like without these kind of employment, without these kind of job, and how do if you're just a kid, you leave high school,
Mhm.
what job is there for you? Like
Yeah,
not everybody
exactly.
can go to universities, right? Some people just want to stay in their locality and
Mhm.
get married, but you can't do that with whereas there is no that kind of like low barrier, low blue collar jobs.
Yeah.
So in that situation, and then you're being told by the politician who promise you that this globalization thing is good for you, right?
Mhm.
Eventually, we will make a lot of money and we will invest in your local area, but they never do, do they? So that's to me, like in that sense, populism is quite simple. It's like basically promise not kept.
Mhm.
To these places have been left behind by the sort of economic globalization.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, a sensitive topic, but I remember one of my friends from back in the school owns a company of his own, was telling me about this book called The Making of the English Working Class. I don't remember the author. One of the points being made talked about globalization, right? And before that was that because manufacturing was so important, and then decolonization happened, and then globalization happened. So one of the major points in favor of deindustrialization is that it basically ended slavery in a
Mhm.
sense that you would need to keep wages low all the time to make decent enough profit in manufacturing. And then with globalization, you see other countries doing that because they were developing, they were new, they could afford it, the money was different, the currency rates were different. And we saw China becoming one of the major beneficiary of this one through the 1980s and 1990s, if I'm not wrong. And then what happened was what we saw China doing in 20 years, something that was truly remarkable in the sense that in manufacturing industries and going on and developing these cities, even though they have their own problems there. But the major point being raised in the favor of deindustrialization was that basically ended slavery. Otherwise, if we wouldn't have transitioned to service industries, we might not have seen people still stopping on that one and still going on with that one. Do you think it changed because people's mindsets were changed or they were more educated? Or do you think deindustrialization has some part or play in it?
So, I mean, I guess the issue will be it kind of depends like how do you deal with the effects of deindustrialization. I mean, I feel like one of the things I've been feeling a lot recently is that we're still dealing with like the consequences of international capitalism. You can't just have like all the resources being dragged to one place. In the context of the UK, it's obviously like a lot of these gains are basically concentrated in around London and so on. But if we talk within the context of the global economy, then I feel like the two main beneficiary of globalization the last 40 to 30 years is basically US and China. And obviously that is not sustainable. And I think some of that is being played out in the sort of geopolitical tension we see today. So how do you deal with that? And I think that trying to link deindustrialization to other disciplines, and maybe we got to look at not just as a purely economic phenomenon. Is it going to be a political phenomenon? Is it a social phenomenon? Is it a geopolitical phenomenon? It's also an international relations phenomenon. The fact that deindustrialization with transfer of or shift of employment from production to a heavily service-based economy. In this hypothetical, it will be it's not a problem. But if it's in an economic textbook, you say, okay, one size economy is going to be heavy based on services, on consumption, other one based on production. But in the real world, where, for example, the fact that one part of the global economy is heavy on production and other one is heavy on consumption services is a problem because it map onto different political, cultural fault lines. And I think that's sort of playing out in the politics we see today. So how do you see this play out in the next, say, 10 years?
I think we're going to continue. I think we're going to have another wave of deindustrialization
Mhm.
from whatever, I don't want to say what industry we've got now, but I think it's just going to continue to decline because of things like artificial intelligence, because of new technology taking over jobs. I just think that in the next 10 years or so, if there's not conflict that we are actively involved in, I can see us just continuing to decline. In the place that we live, we can't necessarily rely on agriculture jobs because there is space for agriculture, so we can't take up agriculture positions. But other positions, such as working in industry, they're all being replaced with machines. So I think machine technology will just continue to get better and better, and that'll mean there's going to be less and less jobs for people. So there'll be more and more in the service industry, but there can only be so many jobs in the service industry. Like, you can only have so many waitresses in a tiny cafe. What I'm trying to say is that I think we're going to continue to decline. And I'm not saying that to sound pessimistic, but it's just the way that technology is advancing. It's just taking over people's jobs. It takes one person to repair a machine that takes over the jobs of like 300 people.
I remember in first year, they would talk about in the seminars in the University of Glasgow ESH courses, and there was this guy who would go and argue. He would say, I don't know if it's backed by any idea on it, but he would say that back then in the 17th century and 18th century, when an economy reached its saturation point, that there's no more money that you can earn, what they would do is basically go out and have a war and destroy everything up so that they have a chance to redevelop again and make more money again. But the idea still doesn't, it is something that not many people would be willing to do in the elite section as well.
And Greenock, going back to Greenock, it thrived during the Second World War. Like, it thrived shipbuilding during the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Mhm.
70s even as well. It was just shipbuilding. Like, shipbuilding, there was people in different industries that were helping to build up our defence lines. And then as soon as we kind of didn't need them as much, that's when it started to decline, and that's when people started to lose jobs. And it's frustrating because the industry's coming from a place of conflict, which we obviously don't want, but it's feeding people and it's giving them a roof over their heads. But then when that conflict is over, then those people who have got like food on their plates, they don't have that anymore because there's no wars.
I guess it does sort of touch on a kind of contradiction with the fact that our understanding of a good, moderately prosperous life do come from a kind of like blue collar industrial employment, right? But that kind of industrial production originate that the result from the sort of industrial employments also goes into things that are doesn't do a lot of good for the world, right? Like go back to the point of the Cold War. I mean, that kind of community that's reliant upon like the sort of military industrial production is quite common across the world. Like you think about places like Russia,
Yeah.
right? If you think about places like Germany and so on, these are places like front end to the Cold War, and there was a lot of tanks and armaments being produced that ultimately doesn't really create a lot of output.
Mm.
So I guess maybe that kind of touches on the problem. On one hand, we are we're relying on a kind of economic model that kind of demands infinite growth, right? And we need growth, But at the same time, we're also, due to the improvement in living standards and level of education we have, and we're producing these kind of society where people like we desire peace. We don't really interested in that kind of martial existence anymore in say the 17th, 18th century anymore, right? So then we have just a conflict, right? How do you like resolve this sort of contradiction? Where on one hand we're relying upon this sort of almost like sort of violent economic model, but also we're not really violent.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? And I think just to go back to my earlier point about like this is more than just like economic question. This is more than economic social history question. This is touch on politics. This touch on international relations. And for example, how do you deal with like the fact that industrial capacity being outsourced to one part of the world, but at the same time, your other part of the world is deindustrialized and is being hollowed out, right? So how do you deal with that from a political and economic and social perspective? Yeah. Because what that implies is that the only way you can resolve that is obviously what we fear about, which is through some sort of conflict, right? Industry, like why it's important, it's not just job. It's also very much a sort of material power,
Yeah.
right? The ability of you to build, industrial armament to equip an army. The ability to not just to build an army, but equip an army, and also to supply the army with trucks. That goes into logistics and so on. So I guess like also to relate it to the point of the Cold War, like well, why is there why are there community like E5 that basically rely upon this sort of military production? Well, it is basically because it's a form of state power.
Yeah.
And there's and to relate this to international relations, obviously the primary concern of states is survival. Obviously industry is therefore existential, is matter to survival. So obviously states wouldn't want to give this up, right? I think one of the things that makes me feel recently is that we don't really have a lot of ways of managing the effects of not just deindustrialization, but just like in general, like the sort of globalization, the sort of the trend that flows in the markets, right? At these levels, like obviously, I don't think you can deal with the sort of obviously a company leaving at the local level as a community level, right? That at the same time, I don't think it seems sufficient to deal with the sort of issues at the national level. But at the same time, we don't really have some sort of unitary authority at the global level. So I guess like the problem we have in sort of dealing with all these crises and all these sort of problems, and also obviously the sort of economic model, is that we're stuck at the national level, and they're not really dealing with this kind of the effects of the globalization and the deindustrialization very well at the national level. So maybe we need to think about possible some sort of alternative.
What do you think the alternative would be?
I do not know. Oh, if I know, I'll write a book about it. Yeah.
Whoever solves that wins the race, right? If we did it, we wouldn't be sitting down there. We would be going out and making it happen outside. That's for sure. Because I think this becomes a really important question. I think this is where almost everyone lacks. How do you solve that? How do you sort it out? All these sorts of answers, but we don't know which one is correct and which one and how will that play it out. So I think that becomes very, very, very important. So
Do you think it's important enough to be one of the biggest topics of discussion just now?
absolutely.
100%.
I think almost every major economist is also onto it. The most recent one, Why Nations Fail, Ed Robinson, Darren Akimokuru, I think they were all trying to address the same answers themselves. Probably not in that book, but across their histories, across their careers, because nobody has better answer yet. You go ask any economist who's interested in economic history, who's interested in economics, would also be onto it and figuring out the same question. Even the principal of Glasgow University, Sir Anton Muscately, is all onto this question. That's why we also had Geeta Gopinath coming up recently, who was the chief IMF economist at the University of Glasgow. And one of the major questions that were asked to her as well about this one, what to do with the ongoing deindustrialization, especially with AI coming in it as well. and she gave out almost a 2 hour speech on this, basically reassuring academics, reassuring people all across that this is something the IMF is very importantly dealing with. But the real answer is they don't have any answer themselves. All they know is how to make money for the countries, how to make money for the rich people, how to make money for the corporates, and that is something that everybody knows how to do it. That is something that is in control in a sense, apart from all the geopolitical conflicts. But how do you redistribute the money, as Max posted the question in the very beginning, and how do you make sure people have employment, and how do you make sure all the other things that are associated with it goes on pretty well? I mean, one of the major topics that we didn't talk about in the deindustrialization is also energy security. We started getting even the oil from outside, and then when the Russian-Ukraine war happened, we saw gas prices soaring at enormous levels. I remember it used to be £15 when I first came in, and within 2 months it was £100 per month in Glasgow. And that is a big rise. I mean, it took them years and years and years to reach £15. Apart from all the price oil shocks that happened in the 70s and then in the 2014, and then now we saw it rising from £15 to £100 per month. That's a lot of money, and then people who have mortgages, people who are students, they cannot afford it because that becomes quite an issue, and that happened because the energy security is not there. Even though we have our own oil in North Sea, we still have to be dependent on oil coming from outside all the time. Even the owners are from outside; it's not Scottish themselves. And then again, I remember reading who was the company that deals with it? Is it British Gas or is it Shell? There was this one of those companies, and consistently over the last 10 years, they would make profit of only £96 million. That was their average. It would be £90, £100 million. And the year Russia invaded Ukraine, they made £967 million profit, from 90 million to 967 million in 1 year because of the rise in gas prices. So we don't know what's happening up there themselves. I mean, it's not controlled by the government. It's coming outside from American owners, from Chinese bondholders, and all sorts of people. Many of them are still Arabs. I mean, a lot of investments still come from Saudi Arabia in this industry. And then we don't know what's happening up there. I mean, that's a huge, huge profit. And people are suffering. Inflation is on rise. We don't even know if it was inflation or greedflation, right? That could also be one of the another aspects of deindustrialization, and that sort of linkages and relation that comes across.
I guess like the point about the energy prices is the gas bill we're having right now is so exorbitantly high is a good point to talk about the sort of effects of the not just in the deindustrialization but also like the turn toward neoliberalism during the factory years. So I mean, from what I understand, one of the things that happened under the tenure of manufacture was basic privatization of British energy industry, which I would say in hindsight was a pretty bad idea. Even now, it seems to me that because we have privatized the energy companies, like even those like the raw, I don't know, the barrels of oil, the price that actually gone down, but it's not reflected through our bills. It's because these companies are privatized. They're making massive amount of profit. The market is is monopolized by these companies. So, and that kind of maybe go to the point, which is that unfortunately, go to the three level I was talking about, the local, the national, and the global. We don't have some kind of power UN. Then the only level that is viable for us to practice some kind of politics and control is at the national level. But the problem right now, as I see it, is that the kind of nation state that we have in the sort of developed West has sort of seems to have been hollowed out in terms of capacity. Because I think like there's been basically a trend towards, especially in the 1980s, to distrust this administrative state, which I think has maybe gone a little bit too far. Like for example, like these kind of industries, like energy, like water, gas, just to use like the economic term, these goods are inelastic. It's very difficult for you to introduce into competitions. But we decided to privatize them. Yeah. So maybe that implies that maybe we the pension need to swing the other way now. Like we maybe do need to introduce more of a state intervention, at least in these sectors, to to brought them back to like some sort of public utility function. But obviously, I think like this also touches on like a even deeper issue, which is it does also speak to the decline of liberal democracy. And by that I mean the democratic electorate we have in the West today seems to be largely incapable of holding these what we call sectorial interests accountable.
Okay.
By sectorial interests, I mean like special interests. Obviously like business, big business, and so on. And how do you assert yourself as the lectorate over the government, over these interests? Right? You have these crises, but but the lecturer seems largely incapable of doing anything about them. So maybe that's something that needs to happen, which I think would do require like people to really be interested in politics.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not to stop you from what you're talking about, but if we look at it in a more specific, like smaller scale, obviously deindustrialization has had impacts like crime, poverty, unemployment, family breakdowns as well. So, what would your thoughts kind of be on that? Like, in terms of, is there a way to kind of save that? I suppose apart from reindustrializing, is there a way that we can kind of fix the problems that have come from deindustrialization?
I think 3 points become very important here. One is investment in digital technology. Second is consistent energy security. And third is climate resiliency. I think that becomes really important. Investment and sustainability. I think these are the 3 points that we all kind of agree might improve some parts of it, if not all. Digital technologies, we might see more people getting more jobs there. We might not see the rapid structural unemployment as people are claiming there to be with the AI, but there very well may be the job losses. But if we do adjust to it, how we adjusted to internet technology, then we might see maybe more employment out there. So that's one of the guesses. Sustainability, because we need more lithium batteries, we need more data extraction companies, we need more industries there. It's pretty bad for the environment overall, and this is something that people are going pretty much against. But if we somehow manage to fix it, not hurting the environment, and then at the same time employing high tech employment in the UK through manufacturing, we might be able to solve it again. And then third was what was energy security, yeah. And if we go on with energy security, we might see cheaper living conditions. We might see energy independence in a sense that we'll have more say on the policies that will go on and affect our people, and sort of calm people down. But these are three ideas, not very big, not revolutionary, not going to change anything, but something that will keep people's minds sane and not the democratic electorate going bananas against this. What do you think, Max?
Just as a response to your point, I think like one of the problems is that like I feel like we have like a lot of good ideas. Like we have a lot of proposals, we got a lot of like we need to do this and do that, yeah. But I feel like one of the problem is that there's has been. Let's go back to my point about state capacity. I feel like there's been a slowly steady erosion of the capacity of the state to implement policies
Mhm.
that actually get to what it where it wanted to go. Right. I guess what I'm trying to say is that again go to the maybe loop back to the industrialization point is that which is that it seems that the British state has lost the capacity to like sort of do this easily
Mhm.
on the cheap, without that much opportunity cost, right? Instead of having to like try and import it from China. That's what I'm saying, and I feel like even that kind of thing, like I feel like maybe it was underappreciated that like having that kind of capacity allows you to do things like to do things a greater degree of freedom and implement change to your desired effect. I think like a lot of the not just the British state, but some of the like advanced economies state have lost that ability. That's my first point. Second point is I feel like maybe if you want to talk about like the problem with like social decline, with crime, with health, with all of that, maybe one of the problems is that if like what is a good life, or at least a relatively low barrier entry good life, should have been so dependent upon like the kind of employment that is tailored towards economic value. Maybe you need some kind of like alternative definition of employment or like even just like value that is not so tethered to the market, right? Like maybe like people just want to do, like become a good, I don't know, like good, responsible, productive citizens, but on other kinds of social value, I don't know, like honor or just self worth or just I like I like to help people. I want to see other people prosper. But I think that's going to be very difficult because we're much living in a capitalist society, and the fundamental logic of the society is obviously revolve about values and economic productivity and efficiency. So maybe that's somewhere we can also think about, like like sort of like another way of thinking about economy and economic structure and what sort of value does a society. But that would require a way bigger, fundamental, comprehensive, and holistic redefinition than what we're capable of or what this podcast is. But that's something I think maybe is worth at least think about or
Okay.
exploring. But yeah, I feel like maybe that's where we're headed as well, perhaps. But yeah, I don't think maybe just to go back to look back to the point about the industrialization. Maybe it's not a good idea to anchor everybody's definition of good, stable, easily accessible life to become a blue collar worker.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I was gonna say the same thing. But I think the important point Max raised here was the one he did in the beginning, that was about state capacity. I think that becomes really important, especially in Britain, that we have all these good ideas, as you mentioned. Like we have a lot of good ideas, we have a lot of good proposals, and all the 3 points that I made that might work as well, right? The only problem is that how do you execute them? How do you go out and implement them? And in the Britain, we see always them failing to implement those ideas, right? There was an idea made in 2010 about monorails from Glasgow to Edinburgh. Sounds really brilliant, really nice. It would have cost only £2 billion, and it would have taken 20 minutes to go from Glasgow to Edinburgh, and that would have been lovely, right? I would have loved it. And then we're talking about Clyde Express Metro. We only have, we got brilliant, Clockworks Orange, right? We got a brilliant subway out there. It's a V circle. It goes around. It goes all places. But then again, it neglects Maryhill. It neglects Finiston. It neglects students. It neglects Braehead. It neglects almost all part of East Glasgow, right? And they've been trying to sort this out for like last 50 years, and they've still not done anything. But 2 years ago, Glasgow City Council did come up with an idea: oh, we will make this Clyde Metro, and it would go on touch Braehead, it would go on touch all south side area as well, it would Newton Mearns as well, it would touch Airport, it would touch Maryhill, it would touch East End of Glasgow. But guess when it's gonna be open, if they start doing it today, even though they've not started building anything yet, they've not even started with fundraising and all those things, and the target year is 2040. Then will be that's
Right.
15 years from now is what they believe is going to happen, and they can always cancel it. They can always say, oh, it's going to take another 5 years, another 10 years. So look how difficult it becomes. They started building railways from HS2, right?
Yeah.
HS2, and that's, yeah, I could see the faces. And the cancel, why? It was supposed to be a 10-20 billion dollar investment in and out, and they did that for a very long time, right? There was this huge campaign where it was really, really popular among the electorate as well. And then one day they said, oh, it was costing us £100 billion to build railways, and then it was cancelled the next day. So
So
it's really, really difficult. I mean, we
yeah.
can't even build railways on our own. And now we're talking about this other big ideas of reindustrialization, of going against the other countries that are stealing the jobs, stealing the manufacturing, and then going against and making that energy independence thing, going against American investors, Saudi Arabian investors, right? Even though they can do it, I'm not hurting anyone's ego here, but it becomes really, really troubling for the government basically to go on enact those policies. And I think that's one of another the reason why I keep on saying in the beginning that they're good ideas, but like how they're gonna be settled down, how we gonna sort this out is really tricky, really, really tough. And that is why I keep on saying that whoever gets this, whoever does this, will probably become that idea of being competitive, being always been number one on the top of geopolitical game.
So what do you think the issue is behind that? Like, why are they not doing it? Do you think it's money? Do you think it's lack of resources?
I used to have more conservative idea on this. That is the only place I used to agree with the conservative. That's probably bureaucracy. But growing up, I don't think bureaucracy is the reason. I think what bureaucracy do is basically go on, follow rules and regulations, go on, follow what politicians are saying, and making sure everything is fair and free and regulated. But it's clearly not bureaucracy. I think lots of it is about the will that comes along from the politicians as the things change rapidly because of social media. I think that also plays a big important role with the information flying around. The loss of campaign and generally politicians they don't want hate themselves. I mean, one thing is politicians are gonna get hate all the time, but somehow in Britain, I think politicians, some are very good at it, some are okay with being hated, some are not. Mostly they're not. I think it's in the culture, right? People generally don't want to be hated, and I think it comes from a lot of things that they might be hated and or they might get really unpopular, and then there are all sorts of threats being in politics that comes along, and then things changes, you need votes, you need to be back in the game, and you change all the time. Like, look at Labour now, they promised so many things. We will build more homes, we will sort supply chain socialism is at the heart of Rachel Reeves economic policies. Where is it today? It's all austerity, back austerity again. Why? Because the bond market was again threatening the economy establishment, and they were being fair that there would be less trust movement again. Now they have to go back to the austerity pathway, bring stability to the financial guys, right? It's all about stability. It's all about winning the electorate. It's all about convincing both business lobbies and people. So it gets really tough for people. And the one particular thing that is my own personal opinion that I find is that if I go on, and I'm Indian, right, and I go on and look at Indian politics, I think what people are talking about, they have this vision for India, right? They want to do this, and it's pretty much established, and that is why the current administration is so successful in what they're doing, whether by right or wrong. And then I go back and look at British politics. I don't even think people have this great vision for Britain or what they want to do with Britain. They're so confused between America, Europe, and then should we make this old great British Empire again, or we should make this new Great Britain, which is the boss and head, and this beauty of multiculturalism. So all these ideas are there, but the problem is nobody knows what should be the right answer, because the electorate is not saying them anything. All they want is good life. And then the parties themselves are not claiming anything. And then there's this one guy, this pressure group guy, Nigel Farage. He comes in and he goes on and he validates everything and he wins elections, basically because he's validating each and everything out there. So I think that becomes one of the things that do people in Britain have this vision for what they want, clear vision, a right vision, in a sense that they're okay with going on this one path or they're okay with going another path. So I think that becomes really important, that what kind of political vision, what kind of political balance do they have?
I guess like if you want to talk about like why it's like so difficult to build infrastructure in the UK, it's quite a few reasons. So I guess one of the most immediate one is basically, well, but this is very much like country will respect property rights. You know, obviously, that stage of development of infrastructures is already over. That's like back in the 19th century and 20th century. So it's very hard to build infrastructure now without having to negotiate with like lots of landowners and homeowners and the compensations, and, like not in my backyard, that kind of thing. So that's probably what was so difficult.
I mean, also inflation. I mean, that's the major point that all the conservatives keep on bringing. They're like, oh, if you're gonna invest money in, you're gonna make more employment out, and then you're gonna rise inflation. So no, we're not doing it.
And maybe the other point is like this is something we discuss. You will learn in the British capitalism course in honors here, which is that one of the effects of obviously deindustrialization, move towards the services, is that Britain is very much like a economy dependent on a finance model, financial models, and one of the effects of that for a financial model, I think, like people don't really appreciate is that the kind of people who are in power or at least have influence are going to be financiers who are very short term driven. So like one of the effects of that is obviously that they can't really think long term. They're not used to it, and they're very used to obviously trying to like make money in for 5 years. So in that sense, then they don't really maybe appreciate the effects of having like spending money investing in infrastructure and so on. They just don't have the patience for it. They want to see return now, that kind of thing. So that may be one of the detrimental effects of like leaning too much into services and sectors and so on. Like you are producing people who like obviously pretty smart people, but nevertheless they're very much shaped by that kind of industries that come out of banking, come out of finance, come out of services, who don't really appreciate these kind of long term projects. And in that sense, then, but also that sort of go on to your point about like political vision, and also the problem with like the erosion of like a democratic electorate. If you have leaders like this, then you need some kind of democratic accountability to say, I don't think you're good at your job. can you go?
Mhm.
But the problem is that the electorate is too divided,
Okay.
right? Everybody agrees that things are wrong, but they can't really agree on how to fix it, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Obviously, you can go into the problem with like division around class, ideological lines, and people have different interests and preferences and so on. And that's a problem. You can't agree on this. But the solution is that you do actually have to come to some sort of consensus.
So if we wrap all this up back to deindustrialisation in the 50s, 60s, etc., do you have any last minute remarks that you want to make about anything, about how maybe we could have done it differently, for example, how we could have recovered differently, what could have helped to prevent it, maybe?
I guess one of the interesting thing about the course I take, with Abheer, British Capitalism, highly recommend you guys to take if you're interested in the subject, is that UK compared to even other advanced economies like in Europe and stuff is pretty thoroughly, deindustrialized, even compared to places like France and Germany, right? And one of the effects of that is this idea of like the gentlemanly capitalism, which discusses the sort of residual influence of British aristocracy on British economy. So rather than like obviously the traditional story we get with like the sort of like the rise of nation states is that like the French Revolution, you have the sort of overthrow of the old aristocracy, the mobility by the bourgeoisie, middle class, and so on. You don't really get that in the UK because during our British Civil War, the English Civil War, the basically what you have is sort of almost sort of like compromise between the newly risen bourgeoisie and the old aristocracy. So instead of like one overthrow another, you sort of have a melding of that. And this new class of aristocrats, they seem to have a pretty strong preference for the finances and services because they sort of have this worldview like they don't like to work with the hand. So what I get from the story is that it seems that this particular class of people had a pretty decisive effects when it comes to history in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that they decided to dump industries for finances. So maybe if you say what could have done better, well, maybe you shouldn't have these people in charge. The effects of that, what was going back to earlier what I talked about, which is that you do have now an economy that is generating a lot of profits through rent seeking, through finances, through like banking. But at the same time, you do have a sort of class of leadership that is very short-term driven, very greedy, very cannot think in the long term. So this isn't just like a case of economic problems or how to better manage sort of economic transition. That will always happen, but rather you do need to think about how these processes creating the kind of people that is going to empower over societies, and they may not do a good job about it. So you do have to think about like what kind of people you are like creating in leadership positions in the long term.
Okay. Well, I think that's us done. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening, and thank you to our special guest, Max. We had some really riveting conversations, and hopefully this will help to expand your knowledge more on deindustrialisation and how it impacts modern society. See you next time.
Thank
Thank you.